How on earth do we find the time to write a book? I'm Belinda Pollard from smallbluedog.com. Every time I see one of these stories about, how to get your book written this year or how to write a book in a month or all these other interesting titles, I'm hoping for a magic answer, some special technique that will pack all this extra time into my day or my weekly schedule so that I can magically get this book written. Every time I'm pretty much disappointed. And I think the reason is that we all have exactly the same amount of time. We all have 24 hours in a day, and that's all there is. But what I've discovered over time with looking at myself and with looking at other authors is that it's not so much about the quantity of time that we have as about the psychological barriers we tend to erect for ourselves between us and our writing. I've got a couple of little stories I'd like to tell you. The first one is about a wonderful house in the mountains, a beautiful old house where writers go to write. And they sit around in the evening round the fire and they talk about books and writing and publishing. And they sit in their own private little room during the day and they write and write and write. And I got a week's retreat at this particular house a few years ago. And I sat in the winter sun and my fingers flew across the keyboard, and some days there was mist and that was possibly even better. And I wrote 4,000 words a day. Yes, that is not a typo. I wrote 4,000 words a day. By the end of the week, I'd written more than 20,000 words. And the lesson is clear, isn't it? I need a magic writing cottage. I need to be in the right place and in the right mood, and then I'll be able to write my books. Possibly a cottage a bit like this one. I'm a bit of a fan of lighthouses, so that one could be even better. The second story. The second story is about one of my clients, one of my editing clients, who we'll call Bill for the purposes of the story. And Bill had a very important, a very stressful kind of a job. And he would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning before he went off to his stressful kind of a job and write for an hour before work. And he did this diligently, day in and day out. And he wrote his book and he got it written. And it's a good book. It's been out a few years. It's been reprinted several times. It's been translated into other languages. Now, I looked at Bill's story and I thought, well, that's all very well for him, but I'm not a morning person, so I couldn't possibly do that. And I made a lot of excuses. But after a while, I thought, I might give it a bit of a go. I might just try it and see if it could possibly work for me. So I set my alarm and I got up at 5 in the morning. It was winter, so it was still dark at that time. And I did write. It was hard work, but I got up and I did it and I wrote. And I wasn't always feeling very inspired, but I just kept going and kept writing. And the really interesting thing is there's parts of that manuscript that I've written in more of that retreat kind of atmosphere, and there's the parts that I've written at 5 o'clock in the morning under duress, having to get up in the cold and the dark. And when I look back at that manuscript, I can't actually tell which parts were written in which place. Isn't that interesting? I can't tell the difference. Apparently, my writing is much the same, no matter how I'm feeling. There's a couple of questions that arise from all of this for you and for me about finding the time to write our books. The first question is, how much do I want it? How much do I want it? How much do I really want to write this book? Will I get up at 5 to do it, if that's what it takes? Will I write whenever and wherever I can in all the crazy mess of life, instead of waiting for everything to be just right? Will I write whether or not I'm in the mood, or will I insist that I have to wait for my muse to come? Now, a couple of things to say about that. We need to be kind to ourselves. There are going to be phases in life where we're not going to be able to write for various reasons. And also, just because the 5 a.m. did work okay for me, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get up at 5 a.m. if you're serious about your writing. But it might mean being a little bit more creative about finding those time slots and the spaces and the little wedges of time in different parts of our schedules throughout the week where perhaps you can slot in some writing time. And it might be that you can have a go at the getting up at 5. And I know someone else who she says that it doesn't work for her. She's tried that, but what she finds is she prefers to stay up later when it's quiet in the later hours, and that's a good time for her to write. We're all different. I also have, I've got a friend who had a really horrendous year last year, and yet she somehow managed to write pretty much every day during that year, and I was so impressed. But she said to me that she finds it stress relieving. Like when everything else is falling apart, she's writing fiction, going into her novel and I guess creating something that is under her control, maybe that gives her a bit of a sense of stress relief. But we are all different, and we will all find our own solutions to this particular problem. But can I just suggest to you that if we're really keen, if we really do want to write a book, there probably will be a way to find that time. One of the things that happened for me was I came to this realization that if I don't want it enough to write my book in the mess of everyday life, there's a good chance that I wouldn't write it in the magic writing cottage either. We've got to really, really want it, I think, something like that. It's a lot of work. It's a big undertaking. We have to really want it to find the time to write. The second remember I mentioned there were 2 questions. The second psychological barrier I think is even more insidious because it can hide. Will I give myself permission to write? For me, there's a couple of things going on behind that one, because I've struggled with that issue of permission at times. I've wondered whether this particular book I was working on was worth writing. I've been the published author of Biblical Meditations for many years, and they seemed a little bit more worthy to me than the crime novel that I secretly longed to write and kept denying myself. I kept denying myself the chance to work on that book. The second thing was that I've been writing for a living virtually my whole career, and there was that issue of, what if this book never gets published? What if I spend all of these hours working on this thing and then nobody even publishes it? What a waste that will be. So I worried about those issues. I also worried about not just whether the project was worthy, but whether I was worthy. Was I good enough as a writer? Could I do this thing? Did I deserve to do it? And what if I failed? What if I failed? What if I failed to even write a book, let alone write a book that was worth publishing? If you ever come up against any of those kinds of questions, can I maybe add a few supplementary questions for you to ask yourself? What if you are a good writer? What if you are becoming a good writer? What if you don't fail? And what if there's a whole lot of other things that maybe you spend time on that are no more worthy of your time than that book that you secretly long to do? We're all different, but I know a lot of us spend a lot of time watching television or sitting on Facebook that we really could spend writing a book if we really wanted to do it. Can I also say to you that my experience over, a couple of decades around books and writers and publishing is that if you have that nagging desire to write and it's still there after years and it's not going away, the chances are that it's not a mistake. This is what I've found over, I've I've met so many different kinds of people who are writing books, and some of them want to write it for a very practical reason, which is fine too. But some of them have just always wanted to write a book. They've wanted to maybe make a difference with it, or it's just this long, it's like a little pilot light that never goes out. There's lots of other things going on, and the swirl of life, but they have this desire to write. And I've seen people in that situation who have not necessarily, they haven't had much time, they haven't had the resources, they haven't even necessarily had a lot of technical skill as writers to begin with, and yet they've really wanted it, and they've persevered, and they've kept going, and they've produced glowing books. If you really want to write, chances are it's not a mistake. So how do we find the time to write? Can I suggest that we begin by deciding how much we really want to do this thing? And then if we do really want to write this book, give ourselves permission to do it. I'd love to hear how that works out for you. Report back to me, leave a comment on the blog, or send me an email, contact me on social media. I'd love to hear how everything goes with you as you find the time to write your book. I'm Belinda Pollard from smallbluedog.com.